So, welcome to the Tokenverse podcast series, where we interview the most inspiring and influential minds to discuss the future of Web3 technologies in the most disruptive fields, including the world of arts, gaming, governance, and economics. As in the words of the creator of Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin, now is the time to build on blockchain beyond decentralized finance. We are here to lead you through this paradigm shift by exploring the most groundbreaking trends and cutting-edge solutions. This production is brought to you by DoinGud, an NFT ecosystem focused on inspiring creativity and positive social impact for the world. My name is Boucher. I'm a blog writer and newly minted podcast host at DoinGud. I also work as a project account manager of Raid Guild, and I'll be your host today. I'm joined by Ania.
Hi, I'm Ania Poullain, and I'm a journalist and filmmaker, and very happy to be here. And I'm very happy to announce the guest star of today's podcast. It's Paul Kohlhaas. How are you, Paul, today?
Thank you. I'm doing very well, Ania. Thank you very much. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. So do you mind giving us a short introduction about yourself?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here today. Thanks so much for taking the time. My name is Paul Kohlhaas. I'm the founder and CEO of a protocol called Molecule. And so I've really spent over the past 3 years, really thinking deeply about how we can decentralize drug development. The pharmaceutical system and the way that we access medicine today, in our opinion, is one of the most broken industries, much worse so than the banking industry, the broad financial space, because with pharma, or with the way that we access medicine, we essentially don't have a choice. Like the medicine that is on the market today that potentially affects your life and cures your disease, as an end consumer, as a patient, you have no choice in that. What we've seen over the past decades is the prices of drugs continuously increasing in many countries across the world. Just look at something like insulin that doesn't even have a patent, and where we just have spiraling healthcare costs in the United States. And so quite early on, when I was 17, 18, I spent a lot of time in like different online communities and online forums. This is like mid to late 2000s, where you had the emergence of, let's say, harm reduction forums like Arrowwood, where people would, for example, freely post trip reports about experiences they were having with psychedelics, where it was essentially very difficult for people to access that type of information. But on other forums like Reddit, or there was forums like Blue Light, you essentially had diabetes communities, for example, come together and be like, hey, I can't afford my insulin. Are there any alternatives? And if you're diabetic, it's really hard to just find alternatives to like insulin, and especially find alternatives that are like sanctioned by the current healthcare system. There were other communities, for example, that were looking at alternatives to cancer therapeutics that they simply couldn't afford. And often then what these communities would do, they would self-organize and try to order alternatives, in many cases from like Chinese suppliers. So you had Chinese chemical manufacturers where you can just kind of show up, you can say, hey, this is the recipe to make the following completely untested substance. In many cases, substances that had never been tested in humans. And there was people then coordinating online in online communities trying to acquire them, because they knew that this particular analog could maybe just work as well as the $100,000 a year cancer medication that they couldn't afford. So spend a lot of time in those communities, and then at the same time was looking at the macroeconomics of pharma, essentially how drugs are developed today, where it can often take 5 to 8 years until you can even run a first stage clinical trial. And so for me, this was really like the first emergence of like an open source, decentralized drug development system, but completely with no oversight, that also puts people's lives at stake. But I found it really impactful that people were choosing this high risk of like testing completely untested substances online, ordering them from China. And on the other hand, an extremely regulated pharmaceutical system that essentially fails to deliver medicine to patients. And fast forward a little bit, and I'll accelerate this story. I went on and studied economics in Switzerland very early on. Was actually trading biotech stocks during university. And then a friend of mine did an internship at a company called Bitcoin Swiss, which today is one of the largest Bitcoin brokerages in Europe. And so this is like 2013, kind of got involved in the Bitcoin ecosystem early on. Wasn't fully, like, didn't fully buy into like Bitcoin's vision of like, we'll replace the banks and Visa. What I did start buying into was this open source notion that I'd also witnessed in these online communities that I'd been a part of. And then joined the kind of the Ethereum ecosystem in mid 2015, became really fascinated. And then quickly started a company called Lim Labs, which is one of the first Ethereum development houses, building applications on top of Ethereum. The company is still running today, really doing really well. And then through that, got in touch with Consensus, was doing some work on digital identity and data marketplaces. And then had this aha moment where I was like, a lot of the incentives that drive pharma. So once you get deeper into like token engineering principles, a lot of the incentives that guide the pharmaceutical drug development process today came to this realization that they could be re-engineered through a marketplace design that would allow people to openly collaborate on the development of therapeutics. And also started thinking quite deeply about DAOs back then. There's some really early articles that I put out on DAO design, which I think date back on like late 2016. And fast forward 3 years. So I worked at Consensus for a while. I left Consensus in June 2018, and then shortly after that began building out Molecule. I think today I'm really proud of what our community and what our team has achieved. We managed to launch one of the first fully functioning drug development DAOs, and are really working towards this mission of creating a decentralized marketplace where essentially researchers can turn their innovation and work into and attach their real world IP and data to non-fungible tokens and NFTs. And so our mission there, on the one side, we're creating DAOs that allow communities to form around specific disease areas. So imagine a DAO for Alzheimer's, a DAO for diabetes research. And on the other side, we're helping to really attach real world intellectual property rights to NFTs. And our vision for that is to kind of enable, imagine if we could do what NFTs did for artists or musicians. Imagine if we could do that same, enable the same financial uplifting and funding revolution for scientists that are working in drug development. That's what we're building at Molecule.
Wow, it's amazing. So Paul, I wanted to ask, in follow to that, it makes sense the connection between community that you saw in Reddit and the early internet and our DAO technology that we have access to now. But I'm wondering, what was the first instance that you saw this possibility of connecting the IP to the blockchain technology?
The first instance that I saw that happen in, or?
Yeah, how did you make the jump to using NFT technology to transmit this value, I guess, for IP?
Yeah, I mean, so I was actually like a complete cookie in that space, like early on. There's like, I remember giving talks in Berlin, I think this was like October 2018, preaching, guys, we can use CryptoKitty NFTs to represent like real world IP or molecules. There's an article that I wrote called Token Bonding Curves in Practice, attaching real world IP to NFTs. I think this is like August 2018. If any of your listeners or viewers want to look that up, basically, I don't know, I had this aha moment where I was like, hey, cool, a CryptoKitty is just a picture of a cat. And this was when CryptoKitty was all the hype. This was like this was pre-CryptoPunks being known. Just saying, hey, we can just take instead of having a JPEG of a cat, we can take a JPEG of a molecule. And so pharmaceutical patents operate through marker structures. So if you're and these are like a composition of matter patents. So if you invent a new molecule, you will typically then claim the ownership of that specific molecular structure. And you might then start saying, okay, this molecular structure has the following properties, and it could have the following effects in the body. Thus, we're going to investigate it for this and this disease. But that is called claiming the marker structure is a composition of matter patent. And it's essentially then who is the first to claim that new molecular structure. And so NFTs, or like actually ledgering those IP rights on the blockchain, actually makes a lot of sense if you think of having proof of ownership and had like having proof of art, like prior art. And back then, a lot of my thinking was still quite rudimentary in the sense of like, cool, we can just use NFTs to represent the first discoveries in essence, and then make those discoveries tradable. Obviously, once you start linking in intellectual property legal rights, it gets more complicated. But yeah, that's kind of where the idea sprung from. And I think if we look at the history of innovation, it always actually takes, I think, quite playful use cases to really get innovation going. If we think about the internet, I think the biggest drivers of the early internet in terms of traffic were like porn and gaming. and I think with the cryptocurrency space, or like the blockchain or Web3 space broadly, it hasn't actually been porn. Like, I'm quite surprised that porn never really came around. I'm a big fan of Spankchain. The founder Amin is like a friend of mine from back at Consensus days. But gaming definitely took off. If we think of NFTs as really a big gamification of art and trading cards in a way. Yeah.
I mean, you had a real eureka moment there, right? When you realized that. It sounds amazing. But then this moment until to get the product ready as Molecule is now, there is a long road. So I wanted to ask you, how hard was it to sell the Molecule concept to researchers and pharmaceuticals and onboarding those large non-free web entities? Because it's quite ironic that pharmaceutical industry is actually one of the most broken industries, right, in this contemporary world, which is so interconnected. So yeah, it must have been a challenge, right?
Yeah, it was definitely challenging early on. Yeah, I remember we had quite a few early conversations, or like with my co-founder, who was a scientist by training. He got on, this is like late 2019, we ran a crowdfunding experiment, crowdfunding a clinical trial in microdosing psilocybin at the University of Toronto. And and this is like, I think the third or fourth university that we tried this with. So this is like, and this hadn't even introduced NFTs, and then just explaining to the university what DAI was, because we were doing the crowdfund in DAI. And so this is just a stable coin, forget about like NFTs and that whole spiel. But I mean, actually it's gotten so much easier just because lots of people around the world have heard about NFTs by now. And they also recognize that it's not, NFTs can have to do with financial like speculation, but it's, people associate a much less speculatory use case with it than they do with Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. An NFT for most, like, let's say, users that we talk to, isn't a form of currency anymore. It's a form of representing value. And what we've also seen now over the past 6 months, I think UC Berkeley ran quite an interesting experiment where they took all discoveries that they had made, like at a university, like the first almost filing of a new patent or of a new invention, and they attached those old filings to NFTs and then like auctioned those. So actually, and then we like as Molecule, we presented at a conference called Autumn, which is like the largest technology transfer organization in the United States. And this was I think in August this year. So there's a lot of we still think we're in this bubble, but there's a lot of people out there now that work in very serious academic jobs, or even in biotech companies, and that are actively thinking about how these principles might apply. But to come back to your question, yes, it was very difficult in the beginning, and a lot of us just seemed like complete gibberish. And it's funny to see how actually it all made sense all along. And if that's anything to you readers, to your listeners, yeah, it makes, like, I've learned throughout that process, just like stick with your guns, because if you know that you're right on like a grander scale of technological innovation, it just takes time. And with that, and then at the same time, we're still so early actually in NFT design. For example, a lot of the NFTs that we currently generate around IP are quite monolithic, and then they actually just start becoming more dynamic over time as data starts flowing into them, and as the IP structure around NFT is built out. Yeah.
Wow. So with that, so as you were bringing this to these people outside of the Web3 space and introducing them, beyond just it being a task to onboard them or get them educated, were you getting, or have you gotten any pushback, or have you had people that see Molecule or VitaDAO as a disruptive technology, or how are you, I guess, accepted into the world of the pharmaceutical industry?
We actually, like my co-founder and I, we've always been surprised by how little pushback we've gotten from industry. But it's also because we're not really at the moment targeting the core brokenness of the system. We're starting to tackle the biggest pain points. And the biggest pain points we realized early on are about how innovation actually enters, let's say, the development pipeline. And so if you think about how pharma works, there's if you Google like drug development pipeline, you'll get pictures of this very long funnel, and the funnel is split up into different phases. And the end phase is really like a stage 3 clinical trial. And a stage 3 clinical trial for a specific drug can cost upwards of 100 million, 500 million, depending on what indication, or just on one drug. And then, but at the very beginning of and that's all just big pharma then, or like big biotech companies. But at the very beginning of the funnel, you essentially, let's say you start out with 10,000 potential candidates to treat a disease, and in the end, you end up with one. And today, that entire process happens inside of single companies, or it's always one organization that is trying to like sort through everything and produce the data to then help accelerate a compound. And so, but the biggest, let's say, pain point in that funnel today, in terms of like innovation discovery or like drug discovery, is in the very early stages, where there's a researcher somewhere at a lab at a university or at a biotech company that has a great idea and wants to test a hypothesis. And there's a common, let's say, phenomenon there called the Valley of Death. So if you Google the Valley of Death in drug discovery, it's essentially, there's a big funding gap from like just having enough data actually to raise capital to bring it into humans, or even just to test it in mice. and that stage can typically cost between like 50,000 to like 500K. In some cases, you go up to $1 million or 2 million. And it's what's called a killer experiment. A killer experiment would determine, yes, this drug or this potential therapeutic has a lot of merit, it could work, or it's like, this is a bogus idea and it shouldn't continue. And there's a big lack of willingness from the industry to invest in that stage, because it's really hard to find the researchers. It's really hard to look at that very early stage data, whether it makes sense. A lot of it is like relationship driven. Do I know the professor who has this idea? Have they published a couple of good papers? And so also, if you're like a nobody that's not well known in the space, or like if your biotech company isn't located in Oxford near MIT or Stanford, it's really hard for you to get funding to do those killer experiments. So there's actually such a diversity of like potential molecules and therapeutics that people are working on, but no one's funding them through the Valley of Death. And we realized that fairly early on, and this is a big problem that pharma has. So actually, innovation in the pharmaceutical industry has been continuously declining over the past 20, 30 years. And it's because they've increasingly moved out of those stages and now only focus on stage 2, stage 3. And then you have biotechs and biotech companies and biotech VCs that kind of fill the middle funnel. But there's a huge funding gap in the early stages. And the early stages are typically at the moment served by grant funding. So grant issuing authorities, foundations, that say, hey, if you have a new breast cancer treatment and it's very early, we can finance your first studies. So that's public. It's more like public grant funding money that has no expectations for like commercial development. So we spoke to the University of Copenhagen, for example, which was one of our first big projects that we did through VitaDAO, or that actually VitaDAO financed. And we helped attach an IP NFT at Molecule. And so the lead researcher there, Morten Cybernuts, he, in one of the earliest calls that we said, he spends 80%, and this guy runs like a lab with like 10, 15 MD PhDs that are all working on various cures and various hypotheses that they're applying. So he spends 80% of his time applying for grants or funding and 20% doing the research. And so we simply thought if we can, and there we're not even talking about big pharma or like bio-VCs. If anything, a bio-VC would come in and want to take one of the IP assets and then spin it into a company, which is a very different process than just proving a hypothesis. And so coming to your question, so we realized that that's where the biggest pain point is for researchers today, getting them funding for a killer experiment, and then ensuring that the IP is moved into a structure where it can continue to be developed. And pharma actually, and that's actually helping biotech companies and the industry at the moment at large, because they're looking for innovation. They just don't have the risk profile or the time and money to find that early stage innovation and to finance it effectively. Yeah. In later stages, although we hope that, especially the communities that we build, because so drug development at the later stages is really about, is I think largely about coordination and then about liquidity. So as I said earlier, you need an enormous amount of money to fund a late stage trial. But so that's a coordination and liquidity problem. And pharma companies today, in many cases, operate like big investment banks. They're the only ones that can take the risk and that can coordinate the end stage liquidity. But if you had organizations like DAOs come along that could be patient-led and patient-organized, they could actually come in and coordinate around that liquidity. I think we're still quite far away from a DAO being able to spend 100 million plus on a late-stage trial. But I don't think, for example, maybe we're only a year away from a first DAO spending 5 million on a stage 1 trial. And so once we start proving that like people can coordinate maybe outside of the current system, which is entrenched within big pharma, then I actually think we can prove that the model could work in a different sense. I think this could especially be interesting in, for example, in areas like rare diseases. In rare diseases, for example, you have small patient populations, for example, children that have like a genetic disease, but maybe that's only 10,000 children that are affected each year. And so you have patient organizations form around that. And those are typically areas where big pharma hasn't been interested. Yeah, I'm actually really looking forward, and we're in touch with a few organizations already that are interested in pursuing those types of use cases. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
But you actually already answered the questions we had in the pipeline for you. So that was great. You're doing our job for us. I was thinking maybe it's the time to talk about VitaDAO, about how it works and how people can get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so what do you know?
What do we know? The most exciting thing that I know is the research into longevity. Yeah.
Okay. And cool. Yeah, I mean, so VitaDAO is a global collective of people that want to fund and democratize longevity research. And if you think about longevity so longevity is interesting because it's not considered a disease, but essentially we're all like patients of aging. If you want to think about it a little bit further, and many diseases actually happen because we age. So like if we wouldn't age, maybe we wouldn't have, then we wouldn't have the onset of age-related diseases like Alzheimer's, potential things like Parkinson's, cardiovascular diseases of the heart, specific types of cancers. So if we were to stop aging, then we would also stop the onset of those diseases. And now we're always treating diseases, but they actually, once you start treating them, they cause enormous societal costs. And so a lot of the longevity space has been asking about, hey, we could save a lot of like costs and also like societal damage if we didn't have the onset of those diseases. And then at the same time, people could live longer, happier lives. That's what it's really about. There's different parts of the longevity, let's say, space. Longevity is also quite similar like crypto. There's many different factions, people doing different things. There's like the hardcore maximalists that are like, we should all live 500, and it goes into like transhumanism. How can we transcend our body? And then there's other like many research that are just like, no, actually we could just live to 120 or 140, but just not get like not have a bad time as we age. That's a very simple way of saying it. And so with Molecule, because we're quite firmly rooted within the Web3 space, we've always tried to identify areas that have a high like intellectual or like philosophical overlap with Web3 people. And so me and my co-founder Tyler, we've been quite active in the longevity space for a while. So some of our early projects that we had on Molecule were actually longevity focused, and we just realized we got in touch with a few other people and realized, hey, this could be a really interesting area to launch to help launch a community in. And we put the idea out there, and we got like a couple of other folks quickly got involved, and VitaDAO then really formed as a full on-chain organization with a goal of funding longevity research. And among other ways of funding it, employing Molecule's IP NFT framework to allow the DAO to fully own rights, like legal IP rights and data rights in the research that it was funding. And in a similar way, as in other industries, but so like there's a lot of academic work happening in the longevity space, and most of the time that just gets turned into companies, and then those companies become biotech companies. They get funded by biotech VCs. You can only join if you're an accredited investor. Many biotech, large longevity or longevity biotech companies are funded by billionaires. Billionaires along the line realized, hey, if I die one day, I can't like be a billionaire anymore. And so one of the things that makes sense if you're quite rich and wealthy to like prolong that wealth for as long as you can and prolong your power. But there's also an issue, I think, with that, because there's this concept of like the transfer of wealth. Like normally if like, let's say, if a very wealthy person dies, their wealth gets spread on to their family and their next of kin, but the power kind of doesn't travel with that as well. So the power always gets distributed. So you have a continuous distribution of wealth and power as people die. But if the rich of the world live longer lives forever, then we run this risk of increasingly centralizing power. And so for me personally, VitaDAO is also, I think, a way to like counterbalance that, because if the richest men and women in the world just become richer and richer and never die, then the world becomes more and more unjust. And it also actually it reduces access to those therapeutics to people at large. So I think one of the great things about VitaDAO is, so maybe to summarize, essentially what VitaDAO does is it finds and funds longevity research across the globe. It's comprised of a network of PIs, so principal investigators, professors from leading universities, university labs, biotech companies that are keen to join this community. I think it's just under 3,000 people on Discord, and then VitaDAO operates through different working groups. So there's a longevity working group, there's a science and communication working group, there's a legal working group, a marketing working group, a tokenomics working group, and so all of these working groups coordinate together to identify, and then to finance the best longevity research. And then that research and the legal rights to it are tied to NFTs. And the DAO now actually on-chain owns these NFTs as a biotech company would, or as a foundation would that is funding open research. But it's now co-owned by all of its members. So VitaDAO has a governance token called Vita, that is essentially the lifeblood of the organization. So VitaDAO's members decide what the organization votes on and how its funds are used continuously. So if you are a holder of Vita, you get to decide how all of the IP that the organization is developing as a collective is getting used. And I think that's really interesting because, for example, so let's say VitaDAO makes a breakthrough discovery that could like forever, I don't know, make all humans age until the age of 500. And so this could be incredibly valuable. But then it could say, okay, actually, this shouldn't never be owned by anyone. And also VitaDAO is not a company. It doesn't have like obligations to its shareholders. Like it doesn't have any shareholders. It's like a pure governance collective. So then all token holders could say, we're going to open source this IP. It should be available to everyone in the world, as opposed to commercializing it. VitaDAO can also decide to commercialize the research that it does. It could, for example, and this is the dominant model that we're seeing at the moment. It could, for example, fund early stage research at a university. Then there's professors. We have some like biotech VCs, proper analysts that look at all the data that actually help the researchers at that university to make their IP more valuable and ensure that the data is kept in the right way. And then VitaDAO can find a partner to actually continue developing that drug and bring it to market. Over time, though, VitaDAO could also, this is also interesting because longevity therapeutics many of them don't need to be FDA approved if they don't target a disease in their body. So you're also partially in this area of like supplements. Even if a supplement makes you 20 years, like age 20 years longer, it wouldn't be considered a drug in the classical sense. Again, it depends on the indication. But so in the long run, VitaDAO could also start like bringing its own drugs to market. It could start its own line of supplements. Yeah. And yeah, I hope that gave a little bit of insight.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. I had not considered the fighting of the dystopian future where power and longevity is concentrated at the top. I'm very glad that you guys have the foresight to attempting to fight that, you know, as we sit in 2021 towards the future. I was wondering, thank you for the overview. But I wanted to see if we could get a little granular because you just had a very historic event in that you had the first IP NFT transaction with the, I'm gonna butcher this name, Cybernuts lab.
Yeah.
So could you just maybe take us through how that evolved, how that came from, like which one of your members proposed this and how did it move through the VitaDAO pipeline to actually being transacted?
Yeah, so I think the Cybernuts lab, was one of the first big, like actually members of the DAO itself. Or like, so we'd known Morten for quite a while, and he'd always been incredibly supportive of like the Web3 space, and actually also had a good understanding of it and supportive of what we were doing at Molecule. And he helped really, I think, infuse the DAO with like the scientific rigor and his lab essentially, some of them became early members in the DAO, and that's something that I think is really cool. Is actually like, so when a lab potentially receives funding from VitaDAO, it's like there's a Discord channel that gets opened up. We pull in the lab team, people from like the longevity working group begin working with that lab. Members of the community suddenly interact with these researchers, and they're like, this is really cool, which is a really new experience for researchers. It's in the same way that maybe some graphic designers had an experience this year being like, wow, people actually love what I do. So that's one side of it. And then really how it went down. So we've been trying to get, so my co-founder and I, we heard about this project that they had at the Aging Research Laboratory in Copenhagen. We chatted about with Morten in early 2021, and also began talking with the university how we could get this financed through like the Molecule model, and realized very early on that this was quite a powerful project, and that Morten was also very willing to like do this in like a Web3 way. So he got involved in the DAO early on, and then it was one of the first projects that was essentially presented to the DAO and to other members of the DAO. And in parallel, then we started just negotiations with the technology transfer office at the university, trying to ensure that the IP was out licensed in the right way. And then once we knew that the university would be willing to do this, and that Morten Cybernuts, the research lead, was also quite excited to do this, they were getting quite involved in the community of the DAO that formed. It was put up as one of the first proposals for VitaDAO to essentially, for Vita holders to vote on to fund. And I think it passed 88 to 12. And for a first funding tranche of roughly 250,000 USD that went to the university to fund the first, the first stages of studies.
Well, everything you're telling us is extremely fascinating, and we've got a long list of questions, but we also are aware about the time limit. And I'm very excited that you promised us that you're going to share one interesting, quirky, funny fact about yourself that nobody else knows about.
That nobody else knows about.
Well, not nobody, but online community does not know about.
Okay. I used to scuba dive a lot with sharks, and just find it extremely fascinating. Yeah, no cage.
Oh wow!
Wow. Brave
Yeah,
man.
no cage diving. Cage diving is really frowned upon in the scuba diving community because it's like it's cheating, and it gives the wrong social behavior to the sharks, because you just attract the sharks with like chumming or like dead fish, and then you're as a human you're hiding in the cage. And if you know how to interact with sharks, it's actually not dangerous at all, as long as the sharks are like smaller than 4 meters. It gets more critical after like 4 to 5 meters.
What was the longest shark you interacted with?
I think 4.5. But like interacting is like I didn't really interact with him or her. No, I did. I used to live in South Africa for almost 4.5 years. Mm-hmm. And there in around Cape Town, you can do really cool. I'm sure, have you seen the video, My Squid, the one on Netflix, My Squid Friend or something? Mm-hmm. The one with the octopus, My Octopus Friend. Yeah. So in Cape Town, you have these kelp forests. So they're like this, it literally looks like a forest, and you have these long like kelp just growing up. And so you're kind of like, like a 10, 15 meter depth, and you're just like swimming through the kelp, almost like looking, okay, what's behind the next thing? And then you have a specific shark there. They're called cowgill sharks, and they actually come from a depth of like 100 meters, 120 meters. That's where they normally live. So they come up to feed in these like kelp forests. And so you're swimming through them, and there's just sharks almost everywhere, like every corner. But they're small sharks. They're like between 1.5 to 3 meters, maybe. And if one comes too close, you just like push it away, kind of a thing. And they're like, okay. To a shark, you're actually this really weird being that blows bubbles. And bubbles are very foreign underwater. So if the shark sees you blowing bubbles, they just think, oh, what the hell is this? Stay away. So a shark then needs to be really big to think, okay, you're blowing bubbles, but I'm interested to find out more. Yeah. And then Durban as well. If you're into shark diving around Durban, just up the coast of South Africa, you kind of do these shark dives where you go out like 5 kilometers out into the ocean. And then they also chum the water a little bit. So you get lots of they're called oceanic reef tips, but like 100, 200 around you, but they're small. And then deeper down though, you can get tiger sharks or bull sharks, and those can actually be more dangerous. But then you just have like hundreds of sharks around you. It's fun.
Wow. So if you need marketing ideas for, VitaDAO or Molecule, let's make a film about you and call it a Shark, My Friends. Or no?
Sure, sounds cool. I mean, yeah. It means I get to go diving. I haven't been scuba diving in quite a long time. Since essentially almost since COVID. But yeah, big fan of scuba diving, and that's one of my other big passions. I mean, like the ocean is also so fucked. Like the fishing industry and climate change. If I wasn't working on, I guess, like maybe developing new medicines, I'd probably be working on like coral reefs and then the fishing industry.
Yeah, there's activities there too, I suppose.
On the topic of doing good.
Yeah, of course. We need that. We need those DAOs as well. Well, I think we're just about out of time here, but I wanted to give you, Paul, an option to leave us any thoughts, or if there's anything you wanted to communicate at the end of our little spiel here.
Yeah, first of all, guys, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. I hope I answered most of your questions and didn't just go on too many tangents. If any of your listeners or watchers are interested in contributing to a revolution in biotech and in open sourcing drug development, please feel free to get in touch. The Molecule Discord is quite open and welcoming. If you're interested specifically in longevity research and democratizing ownership of longevity therapeutics, doesn't matter if you're in marketing, if you're like actually a researcher at a university, if you're a community builder, we're very actively looking for community builders. Maybe you've worked with patients in the past, maybe you have a background working at a hospital, please come and reach out. We're always looking for really great motivated people. And we're building out Molecule and VitaDAO in a very open way. So it's easy to get in, it's easy to get involved.
Awesome. Thank you for that. We'll make sure that we can include some links and contacts in the show notes for this podcast as well. So yeah, at this point, I want to thank you for your time, Paul, for joining us here. I also want to thank Ania for joining me and helping me lead this conversation. And yeah, to the public, if you like this episode, please like and subscribe. You can also check out DoinGud, the DoinGud YouTube channel for more podcast episodes and other quality content. Finally, do check out the description, as we said, to find links and check out what Paul is building with VitaDAO and Molecule and help them change the world and take the power back. All right, take care and see you all for another episode next week.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Paul.
Thank you so much. Thanks, guys.
Bye.